Hi, cohort two. This is Brian Daniel, and I will be talking to all of you today about curriculum and instruction and how that relates to strategic enrollment management. You'll see in a moment a little bit more about curriculum and instruction, but for starters, I want you to think about curriculum as the what. So curriculum is basically what is worth knowing, and the instruction is the how. It's the pedagogy of it. How is the information worth knowing delivered to our students? So let's start with curriculum, and let's take a look at some colleges and universities like our own institution, West Georgia, and see what majors and programs are offered. As you can see, or as you may know yourself, University of West Georgia offers so many programs that is actually broken up by letter at the top there, where you can have anything from art education, as you can see on the screen here, to certificate programs about forensic science or minors in women's and gender studies. Compare that with the small liberal arts institution where I currently serve as the Assistant Dean of Students, Mars Hill University. Mars Hill has more of has obviously fewer options than West Georgia, but it does have certain programs that does help attract students to the institution. Some of our most notable majors are our zoology program, which is one of the two programs of zoology in the state of North Carolina, as well as fashion marketing. You'll find other institutions like Regent University, which is a private Christian faith-based institution where Pat Robertson hosts the 700 Club, and it happens to be located in Virginia Beach, where I'm from. So you'll see here that there are some majors that are standard or that are in alignment with those offered at my institution or at University of West Georgia. But you'll also see that Regent has a niche market where it also offers programs such as a BA in Christian ministry or a BA in biblical and theological studies. So students who attend different colleges and universities may have similar majors. However, their curriculum may look a little bit different based on the institution. So you'll see here, this is an elementary education degree at University of West Georgia. You'll see that there are various assessment courses, practicums, different content knowledge fields such as algebra, or health and physical activity, depending on the specific goals of that student and where they're wanting to teach. And you can compare that with, and let's again use Regent University as an example, that the same degree, but has some different course offerings. So you'll see that there are some assessment courses offered here, design, but you'll see here, just interestingly enough, world geography is a component of that curriculum. Students with disabilities happens to be another class that they offer, and one on character education, which is just a little bit different, when we're comparing the education programs at University of West Georgia to those who enroll in courses at Regent University. An interesting and contemporary example of curriculum and as it relates to higher education has unfortunately come from my alma mater, Guilford College, located in Greensboro, North Carolina. Guilford, like many small private liberal arts schools, is facing some really significant financial challenges. Some of their previous administration that was brought on by them, but some from the pandemic. So it currently has an $80 million deficit, and they hired a brand new president. They let go the past president for mismanagement, and brought in a new president. And what she did in this year is she cut or proposed to cut 30% of full-time faculty and over half of the academic programs that are offered. So some of which include religious studies, chemistry, math, uh, programs from all over. And it's compelling that Guilford, being a Quaker institution, would be stripped of parts of their identity, such as their religious studies program. So before we dive much deeper into this content, I wanted to talk about how curriculum and instruction contribute to strategic enrollment management. Specifically, and perhaps most notably, was the recent chapter in our course text that talked about the barriers of Black students and other students of color as they enter higher education. So I would like us to focus moving forward in this presentation about these important considerations. So you'll see that our course text highlights that 6.4 million students of color were enrolled in colleges and universities by 2010. And of course, that was 11 years ago, thinking about how it's continuing to grow right now. In 2012, the National Center of Education statistics noted that the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds of color has increased from 25.4 from 1990 to 38.4 in 2010. And then most recently, the AAUC noted that though there has been an increase in students of color entering higher education, over 73% of full-time professors identify as white. So you can kind of see where that might present and contribute to barriers of our Black and students of color entering higher education. As I was looking for this research, I found an interesting article, or rather a video that shows the differences of lived experiences between white students entering education and students whose, with marginalized racial and or ethnic identities, and the differences they experience. So I'm going to show this brief video that I think highlights it well. This video is brought to you by the Center for Urban Education. To reshare my screen.
Meet Joe and Gabby. Both grew up in low-income communities, attended the same low-performing high school, graduated with a 3.5 GPA, and are starting their higher education journeys at their local community college. There is one key difference. Joe is white, and Gabby is Latinx. As they begin their studies, they enter an educational system with statistical differences in how students of different races and ethnicities are treated, even those that come from identical socioeconomic backgrounds. The assessment test placed both in developmental English. The counselor recommended that Joe take the pilot English 101 class with a supplemental learning community, while Gabby stick with the developmental English course, explaining that it's great practice for ESL students. Gabby has been speaking English since birth. Joe loved English 101. Reading books by Tobias Wolff and Jeanette Walls that tackled issues affecting low-income white communities resonated with Joe. Gabby related to some of the assigned essays, but felt that none really spoke about the Latinx experience. This puzzled Gabby. More than half the students in the class are Latinx. Surely the instructor could have chosen some Latinx authors. And to make matters worse, when the class discussed the only essay by a Latinx author, the instructor turned to Gabby and asked, "What do you think, Gabby?" Out of the top 100 texts assigned in English classes at higher education institutions across the country, 88 are by white authors, 10 by Black authors, and 1 each by a Native American and Latinx author. Joe felt at home at college. The instructors were supportive. Most were white, like Joe, and their educational experiences matched Joe's. But Gabby noticed that most of the Latinx adults were clerical staff and groundskeepers. Few were on the faculty, administration, or on the walls and portraits. Faculty of color are underrepresented in higher education. Gabby and Joe both showed interest in becoming engineers. But when Gabby expressed that interest, a counselor suggested Gabby look into the HVAC program. The pursuit of STEM degrees disproportionately favors white students. 5 years later, Joe transferred to the flagship state university. Gabby is still at the community college, credits shy of completing a degree. The odds are in Joe's favor. In fall 2016, UC Berkeley, for example, admitted 1,138 white and 713 Latinx transfer students from the California community colleges. At the Center for Urban Education, our research shows that the disparity in their college experiences are manifestations of institutionalized racism. We have found that higher education's mission to provide all students with equal educational opportunity is often stymied by taking for granted, presumably race-neutral policies and practices that in reality confer unearned advantages to white students like Joe and compound disadvantages for racially minoritized students like Gabby. Left unexamined, these policies and practices perpetuate racial inequities. Using the methods of critical action research and critical inquiry, we help college practitioners identify areas of racial inequity on their campus, uncover how institutionalized racism is embedded in college policies and practices, recognize racialized patterns in their actions towards students, and remediate policies and practices in order to close equity gaps. Our work empowers practitioners to become equity-minded change agents who have the critical consciousness, will, and know-how to combat institutionalized racism and bring about racial equity.
All right, so that video, as you can see, highlighted the differences in lived experiences. It talked about how certain students are even tracked. Why don't you go to this remedial course instead of the standard course? Or how students of color are not feeling a sense of belonging. They're not connecting with the curriculum because the curriculum does not look like them. So these are, again, just some barriers as it relates to persistence of students of color in higher education through curriculum and through instruction. So when I was conducting this research, I was reminded about the broad term of curriculum regarding higher education and how curriculum begins even before students go to college. So thinking about the advantages or disadvantages high school students have based on the high school where they attend. So for example, there are some institutions that don't offer a large number of AP courses or honors courses, and some of the selective and elite institutions of higher learning often look at the transcript of students when they apply to make determinations about admission. And if students don't have access to these specialized courses, then their chances of getting into these more selective schools lowers. Our text also talks about certificate programs and some of the more specialized programs such as engineering that might require certain courses from high school study, or even if we're thinking about post-college, preparing students and making sure they have the necessary prerequisites to enter into their next program of study that they wish. An interesting chapter in our course text, I thought, focused on the importance and specific experiences of transfer students as it relates to curriculum and instruction. And so, not being a transfer student myself, I think that it's important for all of us to realize that not all new students are showing up in August of their first year in college. We have many students who are transferring and their needs look very different. And one thing, a best practice that I think that institutions of higher learning can take from this is the role of the Common Course numbering system that basically makes it easier for students at community colleges to transfer into other four-year institutions of higher learning. And so some states, as you can see, have some types of programs. Our course text specifically noted North Dakota's program, which was very interesting, but also highlighted some other states that have some similar type of programs. So by creating a common course numbering where colleges and universities within the state are communicating with one another, it can make the transfer articulation agreements much easier, and that process for transfer students basically just more simple. So if we're wanting to admit and retain and sustain more transfer students, this is a best practice that institutions can employ. So having talked about some about curriculum, I wanted to transition into the how, or rather instruction. An important consideration regarding instruction in higher ed is the role of academic freedom. I found a really interesting article on Inside Higher Ed that talks about what are the rights within academic freedom and what academic freedom does not mean. But I wanted to highlight these two specific points that were in the article that I think most align with the content of this presentation. So for starters, faculty can facilitate debate in their classroom without fear of being censored or different types of retaliation. So they can present knowledge as they have come to know it as the experts in their field. Additionally, academic freedom provides faculty members with the autonomy to decide the way in which they want to teach the material. So you're seeing not the what, but the how, their pedagogy. What different types of strategies will they use to share this information with students? Now, one of our most recent texts about it was the Chronicle of Higher Education article about Mr. Anthony Jack, really resonated with me and I think relates closely to curriculum and instruction. He was able to provide a lot about how colleges that admit students are not necessarily able to fully support, low-income students. And so I found this quote to be really interesting. It says, an administrator at another college told Jack that she realized that some of her low-income students thought office hours meant hours that belonged to her, during which she shouldn't be disturbed. That reveals more than a mere miscommunication, Jack argues. It represents the gaps in expectations between faculty and students about what is required to succeed in college. And so thinking about the way that the way that faculty share about what all of these new terms mean, right? Students who enter higher education might not know that it's okay to go and ask for help. And so on the next slide, it shows some interesting ways that some interesting and effective ways that faculty can intentionally design their course and syllabus with multiple perspectives in mind. So for starters, I found that there was Ahidi and Guerrero 2020 provided strategies on ways that faculty, again, many of whom are white, can create anti-racist syllabi through different inclusion statements and representations. So even thinking about the core syllabus where it does offer about office hours, so perhaps even defining what does office hours mean? So thinking about the way that they design their syllabus to meet the needs of their students. Another interesting and compelling point that I found during this research was that There's a researcher that encouraged faculty to plan backwards when they're designing their course. So instead of starting with what assessments they want to, what assessments and assignments they want to assign, to think about what do they want the takeaways to be. When students exit that class, what learning outcomes do they wish that the students will take with them? So start big, and then slowly hone in on what assessments will be able to meet that, and are those assessments culturally competent and accessible for all students. Um, Unfortunately, there's currently limited practice and offered to faculty on how to best design inclusive syllabus, but there are becoming more research like Ahidi and Guerrero, providing some steps on what they can do, on what faculty can do to make their syllabus more inclusive. And then faculty who consider using an intersectional lens as they're creating their content and instruction methods, basically help anticipate ways to support students of color, first-gen students, students with exceptionality. So thinking about the way that they're teaching, are they truly meeting all of their students where they are? Another interesting article that I found was from the New York Times, where it talked about the role of lectures. Um, and so for this, it's basically saying that that the college lecture, the classic college lecture where the professor speaks in front of the large class and shares the content knowledge needed, is in a way, and I think unintentionally so, discriminative against non-white students. So lectures serve as the most specific cultural norm, right, that we all know of, the college lecture. However, in this article, it presented about some different ways that provide a more active learning environment that can meet the needs of not just white students. So one thing that they actually mentioned was low-stake quizzes that were given at the beginning of each class to talk about the readings. So making sure that everyone has access to the course text, and then using that as a way to just, every day present just a couple question quiz about the reading or the content that they're reviewing in class. Minority or low income and first generation students, of course, I think that's important to note, face additional pressure by feeling that they're required to participate more fully. So if there's only one Black person in the classroom, perhaps that student is facing additional burdens, feeling as though they have to speak as, from their perspective of their identity in course discussions. And so if there are fewer people that look like them in class, or they look differently than the instructor, and even in the video that I showed prior, I think there was an example where the instructor asked, well, how does this make you feel? Talking about course content regarding people of color, asking the person of color what that feels like, obviously can feel very, very targeted. And then also thinking about the role of women in STEM, right? It also kind of talked about how fewer women are encouraged to enter the STEM field. So a 2014 study found that while large introductory like biology classes, like the first class typically in those curriculums, comprise of 60% females, only 40% of those responding to instructors' questions were from students who identified as female, meaning that either they're not called on, or that they had perhaps a negative experience with that instructor. So thinking about the way that we instruct and finding ways, I think that it's important for faculty to engage in culturally competent ways to meet the needs of their students. And then, lastly, as you're seeing, the need for faculty to continually adapt to different styles and meeting students where they are, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about instructing in a pandemic. And so there was a recent article in Inside Higher Ed that I found to be really interesting, where it talked about professors and their quick having to adapt to online learning. So whereas the instructor is typically, right, the all-knowing person, the person with the knowledge that's bestowing that knowledge to the students, a lot of these instructors, including my mother who teaches psychology, had to learn how to do this virtually. And for many of them, they had to become vulnerable and ask, or rather say, I don't know how to do this, and ask for help. And so that's what this article kind of highlighted, was that professors, having to turn to institutional technology offices and say, what is Zoom? How do I do this? How do I adapt my course to a virtual setting? And of course, the instructions, even just from anecdotal evidence that I have of working with my students when they had to adapt, they had, various challenges based on that shift where they had professors make them share their screens. Well, that's fine if you are, in your own room learning on your own. But it was a little bit different than some of my students who were in an apartment where their families were in the background, or when they were home, they were asked to then help with their little brothers or little sisters, and not being able to always attend class. And so, even thinking about, I'm recalling one example of an instructor at my last institution who kept a synchronous class, and that class met at 8 a.m. Well, it was 8 a.m. Eastern, US time, but that was very different from one of my students who talked to me who was living in China, where she was having to get up at a very different hour, and engage in that class. And so I think that the pandemic, as we all know, highlighted the disparities. And for instructors who have that culturally competent mindset to anticipate those needs moving forward. So in conclusion, a couple of things just to kind of sum up everything of what I've shared. Instruction and curriculum, as with what we're noticing, anything in higher education, greatly contribute to the overall strategic enrollment management of that institution. And that with the lack of diversity among faculty, paired with the rise of diversity of its students, right, we're noticing some disconnects and some ways that we need to tighten up to become more inclusive, that will lead to more of these students who are entering higher education persist and graduate. Non-white students in higher education persist less than their white counterparts. So thinking about what we can do in the realm of instruction and curriculum to increase that persistence rate among non-white students. And that lastly, faculty must continue to develop their curriculum and instruction techniques to adapt and meet the needs of the changes in higher education. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Here are my references. I definitely encourage you, if you found any of this interesting, to look through and for yourself at some of these really interesting articles, and you can dive more deeply into to some of that content. So again, thank you for listening, and I hope all of you are well, and take care.